In this lecture, I'll be giving you an introduction to the Gothic period. This is a period that extends from the mid-12th century to the 15th century. And overall, it's a style that originated in France around 1100. And I'll be talking later about the origins of the Gothic style. It's one of the few styles that we can kind of pinpoint the place and time at which it started. Within a few hundred years, it had spread all over Europe. And for this reason, during its time, it was sometimes called the international style, although we should remember that it originated in France and is very much connected to French nationalism. If you remember our previous modules when we talked about the Romanesque period, in the 11th century, towns were starting to increase in prominence. And by the late 12th century, most of the modern European cities we know of today were starting to become sizable urban centers. These new important towns stimulated intellectual life, and these new cities were becoming places of cultural importance. Urban universities replaced more rural monasteries. In the 11th century, for example, we have the first university established in Bologna, Italy. The Gothic period witnesses the flowering of poetry, music, philosophy, and theology, and cities become the centers of artistic patronage. Guilds become very powerful entities during this time. Guilds are organizations of people with related interests, and they can be made up of merchants, artisans, bakers, painters, metalworkers. They are essentially professional organizations, and they organize to maintain standards and protect the professional interests of its members. They're essentially like medieval unions. They operate like unions. And they can be also very important social places, play social roles in communities. They protect people's political interests. They could organize religious celebrations and even protect families that are within the guilds in times of hardship. The Gothic period was extremely prosperous, and it was a time of rebuilding many churches. Specifically between around 1150 and 1400, we see a lot of smaller churches that are rebuilt on a grand scale after fires destroy some part or all of these major churches. So we can talk about it as being the age of cathedrals, and these churches or cathedrals, which are essentially very, very large churches, are built on a grand scale with extravagant expense. This is also the age of religiosity, in which there is a new kind of theology that underpins and justifies the ornamentation and building of these massive cathedrals. A city with a major cathedral also represents the seat of a bishop. Western Europe experienced some critical problems in the 14th century. The prosperity of the 13th century led to population growth, and this overpopulation led to food shortages that resulted in famine. There were peasant revolts and uprisings during this time. Also, between 1337 and 1443, there was the 100 Years' War fought between England and France. The plague, or Black Death, led to the death of perhaps as much as 40% of the population of Europe during this period. Also during this time, the church was under great strain. In 1309, the papal seat moved from Rome to southeastern France, where it remained until 1377. And then between 1378 and 1417, we have what scholars call the Great Schism, which was when the papacy split between France and Rome. And so essentially there were two different popes in each one of these seats that claimed to be the true pope. And it's against this background of crisis in the 14th century that the Gothic style emerges. So during this period, we'll mainly be talking about Gothic churches or cathedrals. A cathedral exists in a city, and it is tied to a bishop. And this idea is very rare in the Romanesque period, but it becomes essential to the understanding of a cathedral during the Gothic period. It's important to understand that there is an urban setting, and this setting is integral to Gothic cathedrals. The placement of a Gothic church in a city transferred over to the sacredness of that city, which could be an analogy for a city of God. Remember that urban centers were on the rise again, as I mentioned earlier. There was increased urbanization in the 12th century with universities and schools based in major cities rather than monasteries. The splendor of a cathedral was a matter of civic pride. Cities had died out after the Roman Empire, and this was their big comeback. Gothic cathedrals are also huge in scale, and they're much bigger than most earlier churches of the Romanesque period. And you'll notice from this photo I'm showing you of Chartres in France, notice its urban setting. It is surrounded by other buildings, and it towers over them. It is meant to be the largest, tallest thing in the city. And this is also the source of civic pride. When a city builds a cathedral, they want it to be taller and grander than its neighboring city. Sort of like, a mascot for a sports team. They want it to be something that is associated and identified with their city, and they want it to be something they can be proud of. Most cathedrals were also dedicated to the Virgin Mary, hence the naming of them Notre Dame or something to that effect. There was at this time a new rise in the cult of the Virgin. She had risen to importance as debates in the 12th century increased her place in worship. The term Gothic is actually a retroactive term, and it kind of has negative connotations, as Renaissance scholars looked back to this time and saw it as being ugly and barbaric. And so they associated it and rather kind of mistakenly attributed it to the Goths, who were German invaders seen as kind of barbarians. So even though we now know it as the Gothic period, during the time it would have been known as kind of the modern style or the French style. But certainly this is a term that belongs to the Renaissance, naming this period, which they wanted to be compared against positively as a negative term. So why would a city want to build a Gothic cathedral? It's very expensive, and so it would be quite an investment of resources and time. Overall, it was, of course, a place of worship and showed devotion to God. But it also was an expression of church power, wealth, and ability. As I mentioned earlier, it could also represent civic pride and represents a revival of urban centers. And as they grew, they wanted to have a cathedral to represent their new place in the world. So this also represents competition between different cities. But where there is an expensive building project, there are also jobs. And so as guilds become more powerful, they would want to employ their members. And supporting major building projects like this would, of course, give employment. And finally, tourism. The draw of pilgrims and the wealth that they could spread around was also still a consideration. And many of these churches had precious relics that would attract pilgrims to the church. So what are some of the characteristics of the Gothic style? And overall, if we are talking about a comparison to the Romanesque style, you'll notice some very particular deviations. First of all, on the exterior, we are looking at a three-part elevation. And the number 3 has incredible symbolic value during the Gothic era. Of course, 3 represents the Holy Trinity, but it also takes on a real structural importance during the Gothic era. We'll see large towers in the front to invite people in. Also, we'll often see a rose window placed above the center portal and sometimes on the transepts as well. There will be pointed arches, and this is perhaps the most defining characteristic if you're trying to distinguish the Gothic church from the Romanesque church, which you'll remember had rounded arches. This extends to the tympanum, which is that place above the portal where you will often see a relief sculpture. And that extends downward to the jamb sculptures, which now we have these large kind of figural columns or jambs that frame the portal. We also have flying buttresses in many Gothic cathedrals, not all of them, but many of them. And you'll notice that there are these exterior buttresses that are placed in order to support the thin, tall walls of a cathedral, and they become increasingly decorative in nature. And they're called flying buttresses because they are separate from the actual wall, and they appear to kind of fly away from the building. On the interior, we see the height of that exterior facade translated to height and soaring ceilings on the interior. And what makes this possible are those flying buttresses on the outside. The weight and thrust of the masonry is now extended outwards to these pinnacles on the exterior, which allows for very thin walls that are made up mostly of stained glass windows. Down below, we have cluster piers, which are they look like skinny columns all bunched together like the stems in a bouquet of flowers, but they give, although they look very thin and elegant, they give a lot of structural support. We also see those pointed arches that we saw on the exterior extend to the interior, which also have a structural value. They allow for, again, these taller and taller walls. We have ribbed vaulting, so we have the expression of masonry joints, again with pointed arches. And one of probably the most important interior trait is stained glass windows and lots of light that floods into the interior and really has a symbolic value in Gothic cathedrals. As light transmits through the windows, through this sort of prismatic, kaleidoscopic, vivid, colored windows, the light transforms just as when you walk into a church, you are meant to transform through the grace of God. And here's just a quick comparison so you can see the radical transformation from a Romanesque church, which seems heavy and weighty in material, to the Gothic, which seems to soar and is filled with light.